If you're a mom who's looking into daycare for the first time, there's a lot of things to consider. In fact, you might be able to relate to Jordan. She writes, I've been so caught up in all the excitement of the baby planning that I've basically done nothing for daycare and I'm starting to freak out a little. I'm worried about the cost of everything, finding a spot, and making sure she's in good hands. Do you or any other moms have tips as I start my search? I hope I'm not too late. Well, Jordan, today's episode is just for you. We're going to be talking about cost considerations and a few controversial topics when it comes to searching for childcare. But before we dive into today's topic, if we haven't hung out before, my name is Brianna. I'm also a fellow mom and a money coach, and here we talk about all things real money and real life. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into today's conversation. Jordan, I think that a lot of moms can really relate to how you're feeling anxious about that need to return to work when you don't have childcare lined up just yet. In fact, I felt this I think even in my first trimester, it just kind of was like, the clock is ticking, the clock is ticking. I know I need to find childcare. With so many different things to look into and research, it was so overwhelming, and it was like, I just didn't almost know where to start. So we're going to talk about different things to be looking for and asking for as you go about your daycare search. And when I say daycare, I really mean childcare. I'm not necessarily advocating that it needs to be a daycare center. I think there's a lot of really great in-home private childcare options. So for the course of our conversation today, I am going to kind of probably use those terms interchangeably, and I'm not necessarily an advocate of one over the other. I think there's really good options for both. I don't know how far along you are, but typically you're going to want to start your daycare or childcare search anywhere from 3 to 6 months before need, and depending on how long you're going to have your maternity leave, you might actually need to start that search soon if you haven't already. For some women, if they have a really short maternity leave, that means they're going to have to start that search within the first trimester. And you may be thinking, why do I need so much time? Well, you want this much time so you can do all of the research to actually go and interview or tour these different places, call references, ask around your community, and make sure that you feel very comfortable with leaving your child in the care of whomever is going to be watching your child while you're away working. You don't want to necessarily just default to just picking a spot because you're under a big time crunch. You want to make sure that it's the best fit for you and you feel confident leaving your child in the care of whomever is going to be taking care of them. So that's a big reason why you want to start your daycare or childcare search right away. When it comes to daycare costs, because you did say that that was a big consideration, which I think a lot of us as moms, when it comes to childcare, is how much is it going to cost us? Because, it can be very expensive. I've heard of some people saying oh my gosh, childcare in and of itself is like taking out a second mortgage. Now, hopefully that's not the case for you, but the two big factors that are going to play into how much you're going to end up paying are going to be the age of your child and the location that you live. Now, unfortunately, just like a lot of other things in our life, the higher cost of living is going to be in more city or metropolitan areas versus the lower cost of living is typically going to be in the more rural locations. As your baby ages, generally the cost of care decreases. These are just national averages, so you have a ballpark figure. There's wide varying degrees on cost, but typically infants and toddlers are going to be around the 320 per week range. Preschoolers are going to be anywhere from $250 up to $300 per week. So depending on what your income level threshold is, that may be wow, that's super expensive, or that may be wow, that I wish I had that price, that seems so reasonable. So for moms listening, weigh in the comments below. Let us know what your range is for where you live. Another big thing when it comes to costs are registration fees. So some daycare centers have one-time registration fees, or this could be a annual re-enrollment type fee. But you can also have additional amenity costs for diapers, wipes, meals, snacks. As your child ages, it could also include activities or craft supplies, different excursions, those types of things. As you go and tour different facilities, that's something that you should definitely ask. Is this weekly or monthly cost? Does it include all of these tiny little things? Is that part of the tuition? Or is it like this standard fee, but then there's going to be all of these additional price points that are going to be like an upcharge on top of what you're going to be paying each week? Because that can really inflate your cost, especially if you're comparing two different daycare centers. Even though you may find a daycare that doesn't have additional amenity fees on top of the initial enrollment or the standard weekly rate, there may be other expectations. If you enroll your child there, you provide certain supplies similar to when your child goes off to school, and there's craft supplies and stock the teacher's classroom, that type of thing, where you're still expected to contribute to the supplies that the daycare uses. So be mindful of that when you start searching to see what are their expectations when it comes to cost and what are the additional line items that may be expected on top of the standard weekly rate. I do have some resources for you to be able to find specific costs for childcare in your area and just have a better idea as you start your daycare search. The first one is a cost of care calculator. That calculator is available at care.com/cost. And I'm going to put the links to all of these resources in the notes of this episode. Second resource is Childcare Aware of America. Now, this resource, their website allows you to search for childcare resources by your zip code. Their website is childcareaware.org. And then the third resource is the National Association for the Education of Young Children, or NAEYC. Their website is naeyc.org, and they allow you to search for childcare providers with specific accreditation. That does typically mean that you're going to have a higher level of care, but also a higher cost associated. But depending on your circumstances, that may be specifically what you're desiring, if that is what you need. Now, when it comes to daycare cost, there are several different ways that you can reduce what you're paying. Some of those include tax cuts and federal programs and resources. I did a completely separate episode on ways to cut childcare costs, so if you're interested in that, I will also link it in the details of this episode so you can find the information there. Let's talk about whether or not your daycare center is actually open when you need them to be, because their hours of operation should be a big consideration depending on when you're actually working. Most daycare centers are going to be catering to parents that are working the typical, 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 schedule. So that means they're going to be opening anywhere from 6:30 to 7:30 and then closing anywhere from 5:30 to 6:30. So if you have an unusual work schedule or you work like flexible variable hours, then that is something you want to keep in mind for your childcare search, because some daycare centers may not offer the flexible hours you need, and you might have to look for a more like in-home private childcare option that will allow you the flexibility for your specific job. One of the jobs that I moved into after I had my son, I didn't know this when I started. Well, I knew it was a possibility, I just didn't realize how often it was going to occur, is that I had a job in IT, and because of the nature of the job, that meant that with very little notice that I had to work like weekends and sometimes evenings late into the night. If I didn't have my husband there that was available during those hours, I wouldn't have necessarily had someone that was going to be able to take care of my child while I was working. If you do need extended hours, some daycare centers will offer that to you, of course, for an additional fee. So the rate that you can expect, some will charge you an hourly rate that will be anywhere from $10 to $25 an hour. Now, again, these are just averages, so you could see a wide range when it comes to these rates. Some daycares will charge you a flat fee, so that may be $20 up to $50 per day, depending on the duration that you need additional or extended hours of care. Some may also charge a minimum amount regardless of how long they are there past normal childcare hours. So you could see a minimum charge of like $20 for extended hours, even if your child is there for a really short period past your supposed pickup time. If you are on an unusual work schedule, or if it is possible that you could get out of work late and be caught up in traffic, make sure that you understand the costs and expectations of that daycare center, that you're choosing a center that you can actually get there in time, or you can accommodate the additional fees needed to cover those costs. Now, if you're in a job where you know you're going to need extended hours pretty regularly, you could ask or negotiate a discounted rate ahead of time as part of your initial enrollment. Now, in addition to extended hours, there could also be early pickup and late drop-off fees. It seems kind of like weird to think that you have them for even less time, should be less work, but you're charging me more for it. So from the perspective of the childcare worker, anytime that you're interrupting their, normal routine, it may be a little bit more challenging to get everyone else on board back into like the focus or routine of that day. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they're going to charge extra for accommodating your schedule. But if this is something that you need pretty regularly, or if you only need half days or partial days, definitely talk to the child care center or daycare provider and see if that's something that they will work with you on. And it might also be something where you can share with another family or another parent, where if your kids are there on opposite days or on opposite schedules, you might be able to negotiate a reduced rate. But just know that they may charge additional fees to accommodate your specific schedule. What about holidays? Well, if you're one of the unfortunate few parents that have to work a holiday, you might be in a really tight spot, because most daycare centers are closed during nationally observed holidays. Some will stay open, or they may offer specific service day holidays where, again, they will probably charge you more than their regular rate. But some may just be closed altogether. So if you work in an industry or a specific position where you regularly have to work holidays, then know that going into your daycare search, because you could be left in a really tight spot if you don't have other people to rely on, and if you don't have PTO or an option to take off with your job. The job that I'm in right now, we don't close every single holiday. So there would be times where I'm just like, okay, kids, I know everyone else has the day off, but mommy doesn't. So, this is just the world that we live in as part of our current home and life routine. Now that you know what to expect for cost, let's talk about what your child can expect in the setting. So typically you're going to have certain staff to child ratios, and these thresholds are set individually by the states, and they can all have different requirements. But again, general averages are any infants up to 14 months old are going to typically have a staff to child ratio of 1-4. And even like hearing that 1-4 threshold as a mom of 2 under 2 when I welcomed my second into my life, it definitely seems like, wow, even that seems a little high, but maybe that's just not my gifting. But the other ratios that you're going to see from older kids, like preschool age 4 to 5, you can see ratios of anywhere from 1-10 up to 1-20. And again, these are going to vary greatly by state regulations. And if you do see a high threshold of 1-20, that typically means there is going to be another support person helping and assisting that childcare provider. Maybe they have fewer credentials, or they may not have as many educational or be in a teacher role, but they may be more of an assistant to that main teacher or childcare coordinator for those higher 1-20 thresholds. Another variable that can affect this ratio is the footprint of the actual location that the child care center is in. There may be a specific requirement that only a certain amount of kids or a certain amount of individuals is allowed in this specific classroom. And even though in a state, let's say they allow a threshold of 1 to 15, maybe they only allow 13 individuals in a classroom of this specific size. Licensing is also a huge factor that's going to vary widely by state. There are typically going to be key areas when it comes to state regulations. The first one's being facility. In this category, you're going to see safety inspections, fire hazards, proper ventilation, adequate space per child. We kind of already touched on that when it comes to the whole footprint, and then age appropriate furniture and equipment. The second thing is the staff. Certain threshold or percentages of staff may be required to have certain qualifications or certifications, such as an early childhood education or child development. Background check requirements and CPR and first aid certifications are also pretty common standard requirements for staff. The third thing is the health and safety categories. They're going to be looking at different hygiene protocols, immunization requirements, which we're going to touch on here in a little bit, both for staff and children, and how they handle sick kids in their care. And we'll talk about that here too. Some states have specific guidelines for educational activities. Are they doing age-appropriate developmental programming as part of their day-to-day activities? If you want to find specific details for your individual state, you can go to Childcare Aware of America, the resource I mentioned earlier that lets you search by zip code, and you can go to your state's Department of Health and Human Services website. You'll probably have to do a little bit more digging, so you can look for anything related to childcare or early childhood education. That will at least get you started in the direction. Since each state's website is a little bit different, you'll probably have to do some of your own research. So good luck. All right, and finally, controversial topics. So we're going to talk about sickness, immunization, and discipline. So buckle up. You want to ask your daycare center how they handle and manage sick kids. There's going to be the big three, and that's fever, vomiting, or diarrhea. These are obviously pretty obvious. You should know if your child is experiencing any of these symptoms, and most daycares are not going to accept children unless they are symptom-free without medication for a duration of at least 24 hours before you drop them off around all of these other kids. A whole bunch of moms can relate to this. It's like putting a whole bunch of kids with all of these germs into a petri dish and just seeing the mold explode. You know what I'm talking about. You've been in science class before, right? Even if you haven't been, you know what happens in your fridge if you forget something in the back of your fridge and you just open it and a few weeks later, gross, okay? That's just how it's going to be with daycare centers. There's just no getting around it. I don't care how clean it is. It's just the fact of life. Happens the same thing at school. Man, they're going to have great immunity by the time they get to school. Okay, so if your child has any of those big three, but also a big thing is conjunctivitis. I'm going to be kind of struggling with all of these hyper medical terms coming up. The simple reference to this specific disease is pink eye. This is highly contagious, and any child that has it should not be going to daycare. If they have a respiratory illness, symptoms like a cough, difficulty breathing, persistent runny nose might warrant staying home, or they may send them home from daycare if your child is experiencing any of these symptoms. Any rash with a fever, so this could indicate a more serious illness and could require medical attention. Your child care center is most likely going to notify you, this child's not well, you need to get them home. Okay, immunization. This is the part where I'm going to have a really hard time saying all of these things, so permission now to laugh, okay? Just you can chuckle to yourself. I'll probably be laughing my way through this. All right, so these requirements are, again, going to vary by location. You can check out your state's requirements, etc. But typically, the most common vaccinations required for daycare enrollment are going to be the core vaccinations. So diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, or the DTaP vaccine, the polio or the IVP vaccine. Hey, I think I'm doing pretty well. Measles, of course, measles, mumps, and rubella, or the MMR vaccine, Haemophilus, did I say that right? Influenza type B, or HIB vaccine, hepatitis B vaccine, varicella, or the chickenpox vaccine, and then some additional vaccinations that might be required in some states are the PVC vaccine and the rotavirus vaccine. So depending on what your individual personal thoughts are on vaccines, at least you can be aware that there may be a requirement before you even start your daycare search, so you can decide what route you want to take for your specific personal, moral, or medical beliefs. To find out some resources for specific immunization requirements for daycare in your state, you can go to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, links in the info box below. They're going to provide information on state-specific requirements, and then your state's Department of Health and Human Services website. Discipline policies. Don't shy away from asking about it, and if they don't have one that's in writing that they can give you, that's a little bit of a red flag. But a rough guide that they should have written down should focus on positive reinforcement, redirection, natural consequences, clear expectations and limits, again, kind of going a little bit back to that natural consequence thing, timeouts, as well as communicating with parents about what is happening in each daycare session. That is the main things that you should be looking for when it comes to your daycare search. Of course, if you can, rely pretty heavily on word of mouth and reputation around the area that you live. Ask family and friends, acquaintances, get some references, but at least this will give you things to be thinking about and any red flags if you see them. Okay, Jordan, I know we talked about a lot of information in this episode, so as promised, I'll link up all the details in the info box below, as well as that episode about reducing your childcare expenses. But I do wish you the best in your childcare search. If any other moms listening would like to submit for a future episode, you can find that link in the info box below. But until we hang out again, create a home your heart loves.